Okay, off we go. Right, well, welcome back, everybody. I want to dedicate this shiur to a refuah shlema for Rabbi Sachs, Diane Ehrentreu, and another great person who's a great friend of mine. I haven't asked him whether he wants me to do this or not, so I'm going to dedicate this to a friend of mine who is potentially going to have some surgery shortly, and I wish him, and we all wish him, a refuah shlema.
Oh, Johnny, you we're also going to dedicate it in memory of the Bobby Edith.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. 3 of us out of 13 people here on this group have a yahrzeit for a grandmother, a great grandmother today. And that is myself, Marcel, and Jeffrey. We have a mutual great grandmother known as the Bobby Edith, whose real name was Yehudit, but because of the Yiddishization, good job, Michael's not here to hear that word, of the name, instead of Yehudis, it became Yehidis, and then it became known as Edith. The Bobby Edith was our great grandmother, and it's her 70 what yahrzeit something today, Jeffrey? 73rd, is it?
It's the 73rd yahrzeit. She died in 1947. Her son, our grandfather, predeceased her, and we only know the yahrzeit because Marcel went to the B'Salem where she's buried. He discovered a Matzeva which had the yahrzeit on. So we have to thank Marcel for that information.
We also have to thank him for the name, because I always suspected that the name was Yehudis because my poor sister is named after her, and her name on her ketubah, and the name she was given in shul, was Edith Sossi, and the poor girl. And I always suspected that Edith was Yehudis, but until Marcel found the kever, we weren't sure. But Marcel did find the kever and sent
Where is it, Johnny?
of it.
Where is it, Johnny?
It's in Romania.
Oh, Romania. Oh.
Yeah. Marcel is an expert on graves in Romania. We'll get him to give a talk one day on that. So yes, she is called Yehudis. The Sossi, by the way, I've not confirmed this, but I'm pretty certain that is going to be Shoshana. So really, my sister should have had a lovely name, Yehudit Shoshana. Instead, she's called Edith Sossi. Never. But there you go. Right, so let's get to this. We're going to dedicate the shiur to the refuah shlema for those 3 lovely people, and the memory of the Bobby Edith. So there's lots to be dedicated to, so it better be a good shiur today. Otherwise, it won't work. Right, so we're going to talk about our Gemara here. We're going to move on. I just want to finish very briefly. I want to just tie up a couple of ends from the Aharon and the Egel story with a little, possibly a little teaser for you, because the article that I sent you round after last week's shiur, I don't know if any of you got to read it yet. It's worth reading if you haven't. It's the one that David Marks gave me. Brings out one important point that I want to just finish that little bit of the story on, with a possibility that David Marks will give a separate standalone shiur from the text to expand on this idea. But the idea that I just want to mention to you is this. You'll remember that when we first started discussing the idea of Aharon's role in the golden calf, I was a little bit scathing about his role, as was Nachum. Nachum was even more scathing than I was. We thought that there'd been a little bit of or more than a little bit of a whitewash, that Aaron had been given that the Mephorshim were letting him off lightly and were trying to excuse his behavior in a way that it really shouldn't or couldn't be excused. That was my feeling, and it always has been my feeling. And if you look at all the Mephorshim, they do come up with some really stretchy sort of excuses for him. We've seen a couple of them in Gemara here, that he saw that Hor was killed, etc. And he said, well, it's better that they kill me. It's better that they don't kill me, because if they do, then they'll be guilty of transgressing a verse in Lamentations, which was written several hundred years later. It's all a bit difficult to believe. But this article which David sent round, the concept in there was a bit of an eye-opener to me. And that is that the reason that the commentators go out of their way to make excuses for Aaron is not actually because they believe those excuses, at least not entirely. The reason that they are so keen to excuse them is because that at the time when those commentaries were written was a time when there was a tremendous anti-Jewish feeling, either in the Roman era or the Christian era, and they didn't want to give them any more ammunition, as it were, to say what rotten people we were and what rotten leaders we had. So instead of sort of saying it as it were, straightforwardly, that Aaron's role in the Egel was a negative thing, they made all sorts of excuses so that particularly the Christians didn't have a further ammunition to attack the Jewish people. And it seems that the Judeo-Christian polemic, as it were, is a very important factor in the way that commentators excused various things. Now, this is not something which I had really considered before. As you know from these shiurim, I'm very anti-whitewash. And I'm very anti-whitewash because I don't live in an era where the Christians are using the scriptures and are using the Talmud to attack the Jewish people. The Mephorshim that wrote these excuses for our leaders, and the group of people, if you like, the whitewashing loving group of people who buy into all the excuses and say that none of our forefathers, none of our ancestors could ever have done anything wrong, and we're not allowed to say they did anything wrong. They are really just buying, okay, yeah, Michael Krauss says, surely Hashem would have punished Aaron severely if he had really sinned. Yes, that's true, and I'm sure David's going to deal with that in his shiur. Aaron does get punished very severely, perhaps the most severe punishment that anybody can ever have. But we're not going to go into that right now. So we have to take those explanations that the Mephorshim write in their context of the Judeo-Christian antagonism that was going on at the time. So it's a very interesting concept that we can't necessarily, well, we mustn't take anything that we read, which is written by a human being, out of its context. If you look at the writings of Rambam, you will see Aristotelian philosophy very, very clearly shining out of his writing. If you look at the writings of Rashi, you will see introspective persecution complex very clearly, because Rashi lived at the time of the Crusades. So we have to bear in mind that everything that is written by a human being is influenced by context. I don't have to give you any modern examples of that. Everything that we write is nuanced by the context in which we write it. So we must read things with intelligence and with depth, and understanding the context in which they were written. And this article, which mentions this concept of the Christian antagonism towards the Jews via the scriptures, for me was a little bit of a light bulb moment, and made me understand, even if I don't agree, made me understand why the whitewashing has gone on in the past. That's not to say that we need to accept that today as literally, but if you look at many of them, Aforshim, in depth, you will see that they are critical of our leaders, including Aaron. So I just wanted to mention that point because it's such an important point that is brought out by this story, which, as I've said before, is nothing to do with the Gemara itself, but nevertheless, because we've talked about that story, gives us an opportunity to understand that in some depth. I will discuss with David the logistics of him doing a separate standalone shiur on this idea, because I do think there's a lot in there, and I think it would be educational, enjoyable, and certainly would enhance our learning to do that. So we'll leave that there for the moment, with the possibility that David will do that for us at some point in the future. Okay, so back to the Gemara. Let me get the Gemara on the screen for you. We are in Sanhedrin. We are in chapter. We are in page 7a, and I'm hoping that it is there for you. Yeah, good. Okay, there we are. So there's a nice little picture here, which you'll see in a moment. I wonder where that is. Could be that could be across the Fylde Coast Plains, couldn't it? Between that could be between Carnforth and Grange over Sands, but I don't think it is. It's in the Steinsaltz Gemara, so it probably isn't, but it could be. Right, let's go where we're up to. So here we go. So we're over here. Vahani Tanai. We're going back now to prior to the story about Aaron and the golden calf. We're going to be talking about the verse that we mentioned earlier on, Poter Mayim Reshit Madon. It's a verse from Mishlei. Let me see if I can get the verse up for you. Where is our verse? Can you see Mishlei on my screen? Yes. Okay. Poter Mayim, here it is, verse 14, where I am pointing. Poter Mayim Reshit Madon v'lifnei hitgala hariv natosh. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, and before you are exposed, abandon the quarrel. That's a verse from Proverbs, but we used it in our Gemara, or at least Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. Remember him? Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, he used this verse to say that once a judge had heard the evidence and knew which way his verdict was going, he was no longer allowed to suggest compromise. And he used that verse, Poter Mayim Reshit Madon, he used that verse to support his view. So the Gemara is now asking, this is a very common technique of the Gemara, and it's now asking, okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh uses that verse to support his position. What do the Tanaim, what do the other rabbis who don't take his position, what are they going to do with that verse? How are they going to explain that verse in a different way so that it does not support Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh's position? That's what the Gemara is asking us now. Vahani Tanai, and those Tanaim, those rabbis from the Mishnah, Poter Mayim Reshit Madon, the verse that says the beginning of strife is like one who releases water. My darshay bay. There's a word, darshay. Drasha is the same word, the root of the word. My darshay bay. How will they explain it? A drasha is an explanation. It's the rabbi stands up and he gives a drasha and he gives you an explanation of something or other. So the word daresh means to explain. So my darshay bay. How are they going to explain this verse? And the answer is they will understand this verse kidarav hamanuna. They will understand it like the understanding of Rav Hamnuna. The Amar Rav Hamnuna, because Rav Hamnuna said as follows: Ein tchilat dino shel adam nidun ela al divrei Torah. He says the beginning of a person's judgment is only concerning matters of the Torah. There's our sentence, Ein Ela. Remember, we've had that lots of times. Ein Ela means only. So the beginning of the judgment of a person is only regarding Divrei Torah. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that what Rav Hamanuna is saying is that when a person, after 120 years, goes up to Shamayim, and he's waiting there to have his turn to be judged, and it comes his turn, and the presiding judge, HaKadosh Baruch Hu probably, says, right, okay, your turn now. The first thing he's going to ask him is about the Torah, about Divrei Torah, about learning Torah. So, Ein tchilat dino shel adam nidun ela al divrei Torah. Rav Hamanuna says the first question that you're going to get asked when you reach the pearly gates is, did you learn Torah enough or at all? Now, how does he derive that verse? How does he derive that concept from our verse? Our verse says, let's go back to Mishlei. Where are we? There we go. Our verse says, Poter Mayim Reshit Madon. Now, what he's going on is he's going on the idea that the word Mayim, water, is an allusion to the Torah. Poter Mayim. Poter means to release. If you are patur from something, it means you're released from the obligation to do something. Poter mayim, the release from water. So the release from studying Torah. In other words, if you release yourself and don't do it, you say, I'm not interested in learning Torah, it's not for me. And you release yourself from the obligation to learn Torah, Reshit Madon. You can see the word din in there. Reshit, you know that means beginning, from same as Bereshit, in the beginning. Reshit Madon, that is the beginning of your judgment. So that is where Rav Hamanuna gets his explanation from. Mayim, water, is an allusion to Torah. Now, how do you know that water is an allusion to Torah? Anybody want to tell me where you will find an allusion to the Torah being compared to water? Any offers? Okay.
I don't know that, but could Mayim be incorporated in Shemayim?
Absolutely correct. What is Shamayim? Shamayim is the heavens. We read in Bereshit last week, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim vet haaretz, and then he got the waters and he separated the waters that were above the firmament from the waters that were below the firmament being the sky, the heaven. So Shamayim are the waters above the firmament. So the shamayim, the word shamayim is indeed the same root as mayim, as water. But I'm not sure that helps us with the Torah. Water is an allusion to Torah for an obvious reason, because water, for a start, is life-giving. We can't live without water. The search for extraterrestrial life on various planets has always centered around the search for water, because life cannot be sustained without water. Similarly, say the rabbis, life cannot be sustained without the Torah. The Torah is a life-giving item, which if we don't have it, we will wither away in the same way as we will wither away without water. Yes, Larry and Sharon. You have a hand up?
Yes, I'm sorry, I had to unmute. You know, I have two associations. One is let justice flow like a mighty stream. That water seems to have its own imperative and its own laws. And so is Torah, a self-contained force of nature. The second thing is thinking of a description of two famous Talmudic sages, Rabbi Eliezer, who was said to be like a sealed cistern, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who is said to be like a bubbling brook. The water has the capacity both to be contained and to flow wildly and fill its space. And so the Torah is that both of those things.
Okay, those are very nice allusions indeed. And I've no doubt that we could come up with a bunch more as well if we put our mind to it. Let me show you a pasuk which supports the idea that Torah is compared to water. And this is what Leon was asking before. Where does that all come from? It comes from over here. Isaiah chapter 55, Yeshayahu chapter 55, verse 1. Have a look at this. Hoi, ho, kol tzamei. Anybody who is thirsty, lechu lamayim, go to water. V'asher ein lo kesef, and anybody that doesn't have any money, lechu shivru v'achlu, go and buy and eat. How you can buy without money, we'll see in a second. Or lechu shivru below kesef, go and buy without money. Or below mechir, and without a price, yain v'chalav. So this is a verse from Isaiah, and have a look at what Rashi says. You can, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, it might be a bit small for you. Rashi says, when he says, go to water, lechu lamayim, he says, go to the Torah. This is an allusion to the Torah. Anybody who is thirsty, anybody who is looking for something in their life, they're thirsting for knowledge, they're thirsting for meaning in their life, they're thirsting for salvation, they're thirsting for something which will give them a satisfaction in their life. Anybody who's really thirsty, the drink that you want is not Diet Coke or even a cup of tea, it's water. So lechu lamayim, go to water. Water means the Torah. So what Yeshayahu is saying is, those of you who are seeking meaning in your life, go to water. In other words, seek out the Torah. And then even if you don't have any money, even if your life, you may have a life of poverty, if you seek out the Torah, you'll be able to drink wine and milk without having any money, because your life will be enriched by the water, i.e. the Torah, that you take into your life. That's the verse in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, the poetic verse, which is the source for, pardon the pun, for the Torah being compared to water. So,
well, can I ask you a question? Why don't we just directly say that? Why do we have to go around with these images And you have to explain to us something that is not actually written there, but we bring it to a level of understanding by
Nachum,
saying
it's
it's the truth.
poetry. It's poetry.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a good explanation. Thank you.
I mean, you know, when you read various poems, I mean, English teachers in school would have no job if you just said everything as it were. Yeah, it's poetry, and the beauty of poetry, of course, is that the explanations that people see in the poetry, the images that they see in the poetry, may not even be the images that the original author intended. But that's the beauty of poetry in interpretation. So yeah, it's an illusion. It's poetry. Our prayers are all poetry, and we say also another example. Torah is also compared to a tree. Eitz Chaim hi. It is a tree of life. Well, the Torah is not really a tree, is it? The Torah is really a parchment with writing on it, but we call it Eitz Chaim because that's it's a poetic description. So it's the same idea. So let's go back to our Gemara. Let's go back. There we go. Rav Hamnuna uses the comparison of Torah to water to warn us that when we get upstairs to Shamayim, we're going to be judged on our learning of Torah. That's the first thing we're going to be judged on. Okay, so Poter Mayim Reshit Madon. If you release yourself from studying Torah, that is going to be the beginning of your judgment. That's what Rav Menuna says. Now, can anybody bring me another Gemara, a famous Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, which disagrees with Rav Hamnuna on this point? Anybody? Okay, there's a famous Gemara in Shabbat that says, when you get up to Shamayim, the first thing you're going to be asked is, were you honest in your business dealings? And the second thing you're going to be asked is, did you fix times for studying Torah? So, according to Rav Hamnuna, studying Torah is the first question you're going to get asked. But according to the Gemara in Shabbat, it's only going to be the second question. The first question is, were you honest in your business dealings? Now, I have not seen any particular discussion about the difference between the two, which is satisfactory. There is a bit of an explanation in the article notes at the bottom, Leon, if you probably read them already. They don't really do it for me, but I'd like to throw my own opinion in on this little point, and I would like to suggest that the Gemara in Shabbat qualifies Rav Hamnuna's viewpoint, and that is this. Rav Hamnuna says that the most important thing that you're going to be asked is, did you learn Torah? The Gemara in Shabbat says, no, it's not. It's whether you were honest in business dealings. And then, did you learn Torah? And I'm going to suggest to you that the person that learns Torah and is not honest in his business dealings has not learned the Torah properly. And therefore, what Rav Hamnuna is saying is, you're going to be asked, al divrei Torah, he says, about your learning Torah. And I would like to suggest that he's not going to be asking you about how much Torah you learnt, or about when you learnt the Torah, and whether you went to Daf Yomi in the morning or the evening, or whether you went to Abshir on what day is it today, on a Wednesday morning or not. What he's going to be asking you is, did you learn the Torah in the correct way, so that the verses that we quoted last night, for those of you that were present last night, Ve'asita hayashar v'hatov b'einei Hashem, so that you will do that which is upright and good in the eyes of Hashem. that qualifies the learning of Torah. If you just learn Torah for learning the Torah's sake, and then you go to business after your Daf Yomi Shir at 6 o'clock in the morning, and you are crooked in your business dealings, then the Torah that you learnt in the Daf Yomi is a waste of time. And I think that the idea of the Masechet Shabbat brings forward is a qualification of Rav Hamnuna's view that the first question we're going to be asked is about our Torah. And the question is, did you apply the Torah? Did you stop and learn what you learned and said, right, now I'm going to do that which is upright and good in the eyes of God and follow the Torah that I've learned? Or did you separate it out? Did you go to your Daf Yomi and say, okay, 6 till 7 in the morning is for God and 7 till 5 in the afternoon is for me, and my business dealings are nothing to do with God? Sadly, there are some people who behave in that way, and I think that the Gemara in Shabbat is a polemic against those kind of people. Yes, Howard, you would like to comment on that?
Not directly on that, but neither Gemara seems to take into account Yom Hadin and the Tana Tokef. They ought to know up there why we've arrived following last Yom Kippur.
Okay, well, my simple answer to you, of course, is to go and listen to the Unatana Tokef Shir again, and you'll know that Unatana Tokef was written at the very earliest in the Geonic period, which followed the Talmudic period, the period of the Gemara. So when the Rav Hamnuna made his comment, he's a Tana, so he was in the Mishnaic period, and the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat were both written before Unatana Tokef. So really what you ought to be asking is not, do these people know Unatana Tokef? What you really ought to be asking is, why did the author of Unatana Tokef not take into account Masechet Shabbat and Masechet Sanhedrin?
If you like. Looking for consistency.
Yes, consistency is something that we all seek in our lives. Sadly, we don't always find it. I've quoted to you before, I think when we first started learning Gemara, I quoted to you Lewis Carroll and the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. The Queen of Hearts would have at least 5 inconsistencies before breakfast. So we have to have that in our mind as well. And I think Lewis Carroll was pointing out in that in fact life is not consistent, and we have to learn to live with inconsistencies, difficult though that is. So
I think the question is, Johnny, you'd be asked, did you practice Torah? That should be the question.
Well, it's very interesting because what Rav Steinsaltz translates this as he is judged only concerning matters of Torah, al divrei Torah, and that's how it's translated.
Yeah.
And if you look in the Art Scroll, it also translates it accurately concerning matters of the Torah. But Leon is now going to read us footnote number 11 in the Art Scroll Gemara. Listen carefully how the authors of Art Scroll change it slightly. Unmute, Leon, unmute. Leon, unmute.
Coming up, yes. That is, one will be judged first for not studying Torah, according to Rashi.
Okay, so
an apparent difficulty.
Okay, we've done that, but just that first line. So Rashi, quoted here by the Art Scroll note, Rashi has taken al divrei Torah, meaning concerning matters of Torah, to mean studying Torah. Why did Rashi do that? Well, again, let's have a look at the context that Rashi lived in. We said it before, Rashi lived at the time of the Crusades in a very introspective era that they had to hunkered down. The Jewish community hunkered down. It was not an era where they could expand out into society. They were persecuted by the Crusades and murdered by the Crusades on many occasions. And that turns people very inwardly. And Rashi is somebody who turned very much inwardly into study in his particular era. So Rashi says, Al Divrei Torah means studying Torah. I am not living in that kind of era, and therefore my explanation, which is that we have to learn the Torah in order to practice it, Tov v'yosher b'einei Hashem, is based on a different context altogether. Johnny, I'll come to you in one sec. Avril wants to say something first.
Yeah, okay.
No, you've changed your mind? Okay, Johnny.
Rabbi Steinshouse puts it nicely 2 paragraphs above the bridge, the picture of the bridge. Halacha, the beginning of a person's judgment. Torah, should I read it now?
Yeah, read it out.
Right. Torah study is a mitzvah upon which all other mitzvahs depend. Therefore, a person's ultimate judgment begins with a judgment of his Torah study before he is judged with regard to all his other deeds.
Okay, now he's quoting from Rambam there. That doesn't answer our question against Masechet Shabbat that says actually the first question you're asked is about your other performance, not about Torah, about whether you are honest in your business dealings. So I think that we've raised that question, and I think that well, I've given you my view on it. Anybody else wants to disagree or put something else forward, I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so let's move on. So that is Rav Hamanunna's view that this pasuk, Poter Mayim Reshit Madon, is talking about a person's afterlife, how he's going to be judged in the afterlife. Okay, and then
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
The reason that we were looking at this verse in the first place was to do with compromise and mediation. Do you think that, and it was raised because it shows, as you said right at the beginning, that that once you've made a decision, or once your mind's veering in one direction, you shouldn't try to change it. Do you suppose that Rav Hamnuna, who has a completely different context, a completely different interpretation of this verse, completely not literal, was thinking this all along and had always understood this saying to be about Torah? Or is he just saying it because he doesn't agree with the compromise principle?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And I suppose the only person who can really answer that question is Rav Hamanuna. You could argue, and I mean, you know, those of you who have ever been involved in the litigation process, either as lawyers, as judges, or as litigants, will know that a lot of it is all about semantic acrobatics. And you could argue that Rav Hamanuna has been put in a corner by who was it now? I've forgotten now. Manasseh, yes, him. Was it Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh? Yeah, there we go, Shimon ben Manasseh. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh was the one who said this pasuk supports his position. So he's got Rav Hamanuna in a corner, and he says, "Ha! See, I've got a pasuk that supports my position." And Rav Hamanuna says, "Oh no! You've misinterpreted the pasuk. That pasuk means something completely different." Now, whether Rav Hamanuna just used that because he was in a corner, or whether he genuinely felt that that was the primary explanation for the pasuk, I don't think we'll ever know. But it could certainly be either or. A lot of the Gemara's learning is semantic acrobatics, using psukim to support your position, and then another person coming along and giving a different explanation, so that your explanation, at the very least, is not the only explanation of that pasuk, and therefore it can't necessarily be used as 100% support for your position. I suspect we would have to say that if Rav Hamnuna really agreed with Reb Shimon ben Manasseh's interpretation of that pasuk, he would have to go along with his halachic position. The fact that he doesn't go along with his halachic position means that he probably doesn't agree with that explanation, because really Rav Shimon ben Manasseh's explanation is not a literal translation either. The literal translation is the release of water is the beginning of judgment. Well, what's that got to do with somebody's thought process? We could ask Nachum's question. Well, if you're talking about something legalistic here, be clear about it, man. Don't give us any kind of poetry. So Rav Shimon ben Manasseh's explanation of this pasuk is in my view, is no less poetic, if you like, than Rav Hamnuna's. So Rav Hamnuna is entitled to have a different opinion as to the poetic meaning of this pasuk. And we're going to see another explanation of this pasuk right now when we come to the next chap, which is Rav Huna. Okay, Rav Huna has a different explanation for our pasuk. Remember again, let me just remind you of the pasuk again in Mishlei. Poter mayim reshit madon v'lifnei hitgala hariv natosh. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, and before you are exposed, abandon the quarrel. Now, that's a translation, a reasonably literal translation, not entirely literal, but more literal than Rav Hamnuna's and more literal than Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh's. Rav Huna is sticking, as you'll see in a sec, Rav Huna is sticking a little bit more to the literal translation. And he says like this, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, Hai tigra damya litzinora de bidka de maya. Now, when you first look at those words, there are certain words that you will recognize. This is all Aramaic, but you can recognize some words in there. Maya, you can recognize that's mayim, okay? So you've got water. We know we're talking about water, so that would be a reasonable guess. And there's Maya again at the end of that pasuk. Tzinora. Anybody know what tzinora is? What's a tzinor in modern Hebrew? What did you say, Avril?
A pipe.
A pipe, correct.
Pipe.
Has anybody had in their house a burst pipe and had to get the plumber in? Me, I've had 7 since we moved into this house. The reason being that we live by the coast, and when this house was built in 1972, they used metal pipes. And by the time we came to buy the house in 2007, they were rotten. And since 2007, they've constantly burst. And we had to get the plumbers in, and the insurance company will no longer cover us for burst pipes. They're sick of us. And of course, I got to know this word tzinor very well. So tzinor is a pipe. Correct, Avril, well done. Right, so let's see what this verse is talking about. What's Rav Huna say? He says, Hai tigra, this argument, this quarrel that we're talking about is comparable to a split in a hose or a pipe caused by a burst of water emptying into a field. Now, all that you can see in the Steinsaltz translation, there is quite a lot which is not in bold, and that's him helping us out, because if you just read the translation of the actual words, it reads, this quarrel is comparable to a hose burst by water. Once it widens, it widens. And he adds the explanation, Rav Steinsaltz's explanation, to help us. And he says, this quarrel that we're talking about, it's like you've got a hose pipe and it's split and it's emptying and it's going onto a field and the water is going in all sorts of different channels. It's going all over the place. Like we said a few weeks ago, once you let water out, it goes all over the place. You can't stop it. It's got a mind of its own. And once it gets into a channel, that channel, unless you turn the tap off, that channel is just going to get wider and wider and deeper and deeper. And so what he's saying is, to save the field, the hose must be repaired as soon as it splits. The same is true with regard to a quarrel. It must be stopped as soon as it begins. So Rav Huna is taking our pasuk a lot more literally. Where's our pasuk gone? Oh, that's not what we want. There's our pasuk. The beginning of strife, is like letting out water. And before you are exposed, abandon the quarrel. You can see that Rav Huna's explanation here is very much closer to the apparent meaning of the pasuk in Mishlei. Now, what this means is that Rav Huna is advising us to consider our actions very carefully when we get involved in arguments and quarrels and foibles, anything that causes problems. We have to nip it in the bud, as it were. We have to stick the duct tape on the broken pipe. We have to get the plumber in to repair the pipe before it does too much damage. I'm going to tell you a very quick story, which I think I've told some of you before. Jeffrey and Marcel will be familiar with this story. When Jeffrey and Marcel's mother, Leah, who is 102 and a half, 102 and 3/4 actually, and Baruch Hashem still going strong. When she was born 102 years ago, our grandfather went to name her in shul, and he was a very emotional man, and this was his first child, and he got an aliyah, and when he got the aliyah, he was a bit verklempt, you know, he couldn't say the words, it all got all stuck in his throat because he was so emotional. I'm sure that's happened to some of you as well. And there was some kindly fellow there that said to him, "Don't you know the brocha? Are you an ignoramus?" And was very rude to him. He was not happy. And this person who upset him was from a certain family. Now, around about 95 years later, I was interviewing my aunt about her life. We have a video which we have not yet edited, but we have a video of me interviewing her about various things in her life. And I innocently mentioned a certain person, not in relation to that story I've just told you. And she said to me, "Ha, them, ha, we don't talk to them." And she told me this story. And that was a foribble that had gone on for 95 years. Okay. And that is exactly, unfortunately, our family are very good at this. We're very good at dragging on arguments for generations. And it's something perhaps that we all need to work on. But that is exactly what the Gemara is telling us not to do. When you have an argument, when you're upset with somebody, sort it out, get the plumber in, put a thingy on the split in the hose. Don't allow all the water to come out and just widen and widen and widen and widen and go on forever. Because, you know, 95 years is a very long time to be upset with somebody over something like that. But there you go. So Rav Huna is giving us a piece of advice here from this pasuk. So Rav Huna says to Reb Shimon ben Manasseh, "I don't buy your explanation, and therefore I don't agree with your opinion about the judge and his verdict and the ability to compromise." So that was Rav Huna's opinion. Now, since we're talking about arguments, And since we're talking about how we should not allow arguments to fester and to continue, and we should try and stop them, Abaya, another famous name, Abaya Kashisha. There's a word which is used in modern Hebrew as well. Kashish is an elderly person. It's a nice name for an elderly person. It's like saying that a senior citizen in English. So Abaya Kashisha, Abaya the elder, said as follows. He uses a different metaphor to describe arguments, and that's why Rav Steinsaltz has given us the bridge here. It's not exactly the bridge over the River Kwai, but it is a bridge. It's nice picture that. So why? Because Abaya says
bridge over troubled water.
It is a bridge over troubled water. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he says, actually, it's not. If you look at what Abaya says, it's actually the opposite. He says, "De me leguda, de gamla, Kevin de cam." A quarrel is comparable to a board in a wooden bridge. Once it has stood in its place and been stabilized, it continues to stand and becomes ever more rigid and stable. So what he's saying is that when you first put a plank in a bridge, it sits there, and this is, unless you don't nail it down, you just place it in position. It's a little bit wobbly and it doesn't quite fit. But once you've trodden over that bridge 100 times, 1,000 times, the wood gets, as it were, firmly in position, and it's then much more difficult to remove it. It's much easier to remove the plank when it's freshly put down. Once it's been trodden in and it's well worn in, as it were, it becomes entrenched, and it's much more difficult to undo. And what Abaya is saying is that is the same with an argument. And consequently, says Rav Steinsaltz, the best time to address and end the dispute is at the very beginning. Don't let it fester. Don't let it get stuck in place. And that's Abaya's view on that. So we're going to stop there in terms of the Gemara, because we've come to one of our little symbols here where we're going to talk about something else. We're going off in a tangent now. And what we're going to talk about next week is prefaced by another one of our lovely mnemonics. And it's a whole bunch of sayings that people say and what they mean. And the reason we're going off on a tangent here is that the first saying that we're going to quote is from our pasuk of the beginning of strife. Strife is like releasing water. Poter mayim reshit madon. That's the first one that we're going to do in a series of a whole bunch of sayings that we're going to talk about, which has nothing to do with Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha, nothing to do with judging, nothing to do with compromise, nothing to do with anything other than an opportunity to bring us very wise sayings that, 1,500 years later, you and I will sit around and discuss. And that is the beauty of Gemara. You just don't know where you're going next. So we're going to stop at this point in our Gemara. Anyone got any questions or comments about what we've done so far? Leon?
Yes, none of this that we've discussed seems to answer my query or my comment, which is an overall impression that one moment we're saying that Torah is the good thing, that you'll be judged as soon as you get to the pearly gates on whether you've studied Torah. And the next minute, we're talking about water, which is the Torah, causing discord and strife. Can you clarify my confusion?
On a simple level, it's a bit like what Nachum said before. You have this pasuk, which is talking about water. Water can be either the Torah, or water is, we're not saying that water is an argument, we're saying the other way around. An argument is like the quality of water that goes all over the place. Now, you could argue that the Torah is also like water that goes all over the place. If you're irrigating a field and you drip some water down, and that water goes in a channel and it goes into your field, you irrigate the whole field. I would refer you to the beginning of Parshat Ha'azinu, Ha'azinu Hashamayim Va'adabeira. Next verse, please, David. I don't want to misquote it while you're here. You can help me out here.
Tishma ha'aretz imreifi.
Next. Kizal Hamai. Go on. What's it? Oh, I'll have to look it up.
Sorry, it's 3 weeks ago since we laid it.
Yeah, okay.
Yaro Kamatoli Zal Katal Imrati.
Katal, yes, okay. Let me just get it. Exactly. Yeah, so let's have a look at Parshat Hazinu right at the beginning. It says, Hazinu Hashamayim V'Adabeira, listen to, O heavens, and I will speak. Listen to the earth, and listen to what I've got to say. Ya'arov kamatar likhi, my teaching will fall like rain. Tizal katal imrati, my sayings, the words of my sayings, will be like dewdrops. Okay, so what's the difference between rain and dewdrops? Ya'arov kamatar likhi, my lessons will fall like rain, and my sayings will be like dewdrops. And one of the explanations for that is that the matar is referring to torrential rain that does damage, whereas the tal, the dew, is much gentler, and that is referring to refreshing. So what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying here is the Torah can either be used for something very negative and to be torrential rain and can to be damaging, or it can be like dew, it can be refreshing. So I think that fits. I mean, I don't think that that is what our particular Gemara is talking about. But to answer your question, I remember Elisheva always uses this expression with regard to fire. I think it was an expression that her own parents used, that fire is a very good servant, but a very poor master. So in other words, if you use fire, if fire is your servant and you use fire appropriately, it brings warmth, it brings cooking, it brings nourishment, it brings life. But if fire is your master and it goes out of control and controls you, then it brings destruction in its wake. And the Torah is very similar. And again, I think that fits in with my explanation of what we said about the Gemara in Shabbat. Because if you use the Torah in a negative way, then it will damage you. We all know that there are people that use their knowledge of Torah in a bad way to do things badly. I think I told you a story once of a house that I bought, which was a Dov house, and I shouldn't have bought it. And I tried to get my money back, and there was some halachic jiggery pokery that went on with the chap that I bought it from, and they were people can use the Torah in negative ways. If the Torah is used in a positive way, then it is katal imrati. My words will be like dewdrops, which are refreshing and bring life to the world. But if they're used badly, then they will be like torrential rain. They'll be like matar. And that, I think, fits in with the Gemara in Shabbat that says, first of all, were you an honest businessman? Because if you weren't, then all the Torah that you've learned, the second question I'm going to ask you, is irrelevant. I'm not even going to get to the second question, because if you were not an honest businessman, then anything that you learnt in all that Torah that you did has been a waste of time, because the whole point of that Torah was to make your deeds to be like tal and not like matar. And it also fits in with my explanation that I spoke to you about last night, for those of you that were there. Why did the Torah need to tell us 5 times in Sefer Devarim, Ve'asita yashar v'hatov b'nei Hashem, you shall do that which is upright in the eyes of God? I've probably still got that on the screen, actually. Yes, I have. I'm going to show it you. Can you see that on the screen? Various psukim in red. Okay, there are 5 verses here in Dvarim which uses this expression, and you shall do that which is upright and good, and you shall do that which is upright in the eyes of Hashem, and you shall do that which is good and upright in the eyes of Hashem. You shall do which is upright in the eyes of Hashem, and you shall do which is upright in the eyes of Hashem. 5 times in the space of 15 chapters in Dvarim, we are told to do that which is upright. And very often, immediately before that, we are told here, look at the top here, Shamor tishmarun et mitzvot Hashem. You shall surely keep the commandments of Hashem. That should be enough. Surely, why do we then need to be told in the next verse, and you shall do that which is upright in the eyes of Hashem? The reason is because doing the commandments is not necessarily upright in the eyes of Hashem. It depends how you do them, it depends why you do them, and how you apply doing those mitzvahs. So the mitzvahs themselves, if they're kept correctly, they will be what is life-sustaining. But we are warned 5 times in 15 chapters to do it properly. And I think that answers your question, Leon, that the Torah can be misused or correctly used. And this is a warning all the way through Sefer Dvarim, all the way through the book of Dvarim of Deuteronomy. You see Moshe Rabbeinu warning us to keep the mitzvot, but to keep them in the correct manner. And I think that the ability to distort that which is good is an ability which man has perfected over the generations.
Yes, in other words, you've got to bring the plumber in when you have a burst pipe to make sure that the effluent does good, not damage.
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. Yes, Marcel next.
Very much quickie. When earlier on you spoke about the Torah and Eitz Chaim, of course the rollers of the Torah are Eitz Chaim.
Yeah, we call those Eitz Chaim, but Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikim ba. He is referring to the Torah itself, not the physical. It's referring to the content of the Torah. Is the Eitz Chaim? It's the tree of life. Somebody else was waving a minute ago. David Marks.
Yeah, to go back to Leon's question with another question. First of all, I really liked your interpretation of the difference between our Gemara here and the Gemara in Shabbos, and that sits very nicely. My question is, why doesn't Rashi bring the proof of mime equated to the Torah from the Gemara in Brochus, Ein mime el Torah, which is from the Chumash rather than the Novi, Vayetzu shlosha shomim b'midbar v'lo matzu moim. That mime is a prerequisite of living. They went for 3 days in the desert immediately after Kriyas Yamsuf. There was no mime. They were worried they were going to be killed in the desert. And of course, the Midrash interprets this, that we can't survive 3 days without water. We can't survive 3 days without Torah, which is the source of Kriyas Torah on Shabbos, Monday and Thursday.
Right. Okay. There was lots and lots of information in there. I hope you all picked up all of that. But in case you didn't, I'm going to just summarize what David said. when the Bnei Israel went out of Egypt, we're told in the pasuk that they went for 3 days, they didn't find water, and they started to complain because there was no water. The Gemara says there that the water that's an allusion to that we should not go for 3 days without Torah, and that is why we have laning on a Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat, because it means that we don't ever go 3 days without reading the Torah. So I'm not sure your question's a question, David, because what I put up on the screen was the Rashi on the actual pasuk of Yeshaya. That's not to say that Rashi only takes his explanation of water from Yeshaya. It's just that on Yeshaya, he's explaining to us that when it says "Hoi kol tzemei lechu lamayim," he's explaining to us that mayim he's referring to is Torah, and I suspect that when Rashi wrote that, he very much had the Gemara in Brachos in his mind, and the pasuk in Shemot in mind. It's just that what he's doing here is helping the reader understand this verse, which doesn't really make sense. If you read it just literally, it sounds like Marie Antoinette. It sounds like Marie Antoinette, doesn't it? That you know, they've got no water, they've got no money, so go and eat wine and milk. You know, let them eat cake. But what he's explaining is that Mayim is Torah, and I think that for sure he will have had that in his mind when he wrote that explanation. Anybody else before we go?
I did just want to say that with regard to Leon's question, you were far more eloquent than I would have been, but it seemed to me that it doesn't end, that verse doesn't say that water is a bad thing at all. It just says that the break is the bad thing, that allows a torrent to come, but it's not the water that's the bad thing.
Yeah, that's yes. That's I suppose is the same idea as the fire being the master or the slave. The fire itself is not intrinsically good or bad. It's how you use it, and the same would go for water. Again, you know, if water is your master and you are flooded out, those poor souls that were flooded out in the various flash floods or the tsunami, God forbid, or anything like that, you can see that water can be very destructive. And the idea that Torah can be destructive is not something which is out of the ordinary either. I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Look at how some of our people are using Torah today in a distorted fashion and are causing danger, are causing damage, are causing potential death by their behavior, thinking that they are keeping the Torah when they are in fact using the Torah in a very damaging way. So I think that it's very clear that what you're saying, Julia, is absolutely right. It's not. It's like most things in life. It's not the intrinsic value of something. It's how a person uses that item or that concept or that knowledge or whatever it is. And again, going back to the idea that we spoke about in detail last night, the idea of kavanah, the idea of intention. What's your intention when you learn Torah? Is your intention when I learn the halachot, is my intention to have the knowledge so that I can legally diddle people? Or is my intention when I learn the halacha to do that which is upright and good in the eyes of Hashem? And that's why those psukim are telling us very clearly, after it's told us to keep the mitzvahs, that there is a way to keep the mitzvahs, and it's got to be in that tov v'yashar way, that good and upright way.
Water puts out fire, Johnny.
Sorry?
Water puts out fire.
Water puts out fire. Yeah, it does. It does.
Fire can dry out water, I suppose.
Yeah, we chad gadya.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, let's call it a day. We will carry on, please God, next week. And again, I wish a refuah shlema to all our cholim, and we hope that the neshama of the Bobby Edis enjoyed that shiur there.
Thanks,
Shall
It's
we
John.
talk?
Malcolmides, Johnny. Who's Malcolmides?
Malcolm Edis. Yes, well, I
Is he
suspect that
related?